Guys, we're going to talk about these two gentlemen. On the left here, you have W.E.B. Du Bois, is how you say his name. And on the right, you have a guy by the name of Booker T. Washington. And both of these gentlemen have viewpoints about the way that African Americans should approach society. All right, so move that there. That might be better. All right, so Du Bois believed that blacks or African Americans should receive a liberal arts education, integrate into society through what he called the Niagara Movement. So basically, he thought Du Bois. That name sounds a little bit more fancy. He thought education was the way to go for African Americans. All right, so he wanted African Americans to get an education, and that would make them more accepted into society. Washington, Booker T. Washington was a little bit different. He thought that African Americans should basically get jobs. All right, so he believed that blacks or African Americans needed to acquire useful skills, improve their economic value. That would help them integrate into society. So Du Bois was education, Washington was jobs. Sticking on with this segregation thing that we've been talking about a little bit, there are two types of segregation. You have de facto, and the other one is pronounced de jure. All right? De facto is, it is what it is, basically. It just happens to be that way. Where de jure is the segregation is because of a law that was made, all right? So it is the result of a law. So here's an example. If a large number of African Americans live in one area and the school is attended by 90% of African Americans, it is de facto segregation. It just happens to be that way. If a law is passed segregating whites and blacks, then it is de jure segregation, all right? So if in one area you have a larger percentage of people, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's de facto. However, once you get laws made, then it's de jure. So you guys will pick up a little bit. That's kind of an intro into some of the stuff you're going to talk about next year. All right? It is important for us to understand that African Americans are not the only people that are discriminated against. Many immigrants, and we've talked about immigration and what type of immigrants are discriminated against. Mainly African Americans, it's the South, and there's a little bit in the North. It's obviously not as prevalent. We'll get into that. But in the South is where African Americans are discriminated against, and there's segregation as well. Remember, segregation is a separation of races. And then Native Americans, Mexican immigrants, and Chinese immigrants in the West, and you could say Southwest, I guess, that would be where they are discriminated against. So there's different types of people being discriminated against, and mainly it's everybody but the white people. In the North, basically what happens is African Americans move to the North thinking, hey, there's not going to be as much segregation up there and discrimination. Why don't we go there? Well, there kind of still was. All right. So many African Americans moved to the North for social equality and better paying jobs. Again, they went there for equality and better paying jobs. Well, what they found was segregated neighborhoods. If you guys remember, we talked about segregated neighborhoods. They are called ethnic enclaves. They also found discrimination in the workplace. Remember when we talked about unions? Specific unions would not allow African Americans in their unions. That's that next part. And then difficulties finding and keeping jobs. Obviously, what was happening because of the discrimination and the racism at that time, if you have 2 or 3 people applying for a job, if one is a white person, one is a black person, and one is a Chinese person, you're going to give the white person a job because people are racist. All right, that's what was going on. And we fast forward into the 80s and 90s, what we talked about during that unit when we looked at affirmative action as a result of that, you should be able to make connections to this time and when it started. Some of the main differences between the North and the South when we look at discrimination, it existed in the North and the South. It was a lot more prevalent in the North, in the South. All right, so discrimination was, I use these words strict and pervasive. Pervasive is kind of like in your face. All right, you see it everywhere. Strict meaning it must be followed. There were things that African Americans could do in the North that they didn't have the freedoms to do in the South. There was also discrimination in the West. All right, what we see as a result, remember Mexicans, Chinese immigrants, Mexicans got low-paying jobs, so did the Chinese. They had this thing called debt peonage, which was basically, if you guys remember the word peon from, I think that would be 7th grade social studies, basically it was a slave. And this actually becomes outlawed because slavery, it was outlawed. These people would actually have to work off a debt, but they wouldn't get paid any money to do that. They were just working off a debt. Well, if you're doing work and you're not getting paid, technically that's slavery. So this is something that becomes outlawed, but a lot of people used the law to their advantage, and it was something that was discriminatory against Mexicans. We've talked about the schooling situation in San Francisco and in the West Coast, especially in the early 1900s after the Plessy v. Ferguson case in 1896. And we also discussed the fact that we were really discriminating against the Chinese and the fact that we didn't want very many of them in the country. That's why we have something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. All right, in the next video, we are going to get to something that is a little bit different, a little bit more disturbing.